I never thought my decision to buy a 5-acre property in Boulder, Colorado would turn into a legal nightmare that would make me either very rich or very insane. My name is Ryan Quinlan, and I'm a 34-year-old software engineer who got tired of living in cramped apartments where I could hear my neighbors sneeze through the walls. When I found this beautiful piece of land just outside Boulder proper in 2023, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The property was technically within the Silverstone Meadows HOA boundaries, but my lot was grandfathered in from before the HOA existed. That meant I paid a small annual fee for road maintenance, but I wasn't subject to their ridiculous rules about what color I could paint my mailbox or how tall my grass could grow. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Patterson, had sold me the property for a fair price before moving to Arizona. He'd warned me about the HOA president, a woman named Brenda Carmichael, but I'd just laughed it off. How bad could a homeowners association really be? I found out exactly how bad on a freezing Saturday morning in January 2024. I was drinking coffee in my kitchen, watching the snow fall outside, when I noticed heavy machinery moving around on the back corner of my property. I'm talking about a full construction crew with excavators, dump trucks, and what looked like the beginning of a concrete foundation. I threw on my winter coat and boots and trudged through 8 inches of fresh snow to see what the hell was going on. A crew of about 6 guys was working away, and they'd already cleared a significant patch of land and were pouring concrete forms. "Hey!" I shouted over the noise of the machinery. "What are you doing on my property?" A foreman in a bright orange vest walked over, holding a clipboard. "This is the new snow removal equipment depot for Silverstone Meadows HOA. Should be finished in about 3 weeks." "On my land?" I said, my voice rising. "Who gave you permission?" He looked confused and flipped through papers on his clipboard. "The HOA board approved this 6 months ago. This is HOA property, right here on the map." He showed me a surveyor's map that clearly showed my property line, but someone had drawn the depot structure about 40 feet onto my side of the boundary. "That's my property," I said, pointing. "The property line is back there by those pine trees." The foreman's face went pale. "Oh shit, hold on." He pulled out his phone and made a call, walking away from me to talk privately. I stood there in the snow, watching my breath make clouds in the cold air, wondering how this could have happened. Within 15 minutes, a silver Mercedes SUV pulled up, and out stepped Brenda Carmichael herself. Brenda was exactly what you'd picture when you think of an HOA president on a power trip. She was probably in her late 40s, with an aggressive blonde bob haircut that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She wore a puffy white jacket that probably cost $1,000 and Ugg boots that were completely impractical for walking through snow on a construction site. "Mr. Quinlan," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I understand there's some confusion." "No confusion," I said. "You're building on my property without permission." She pulled out her own phone and showed me a digital map. "According to our HOA records, this land belongs to the community. It's designated as common area." "Your records are wrong," I said. "I have a survey and a deed that shows exactly where my property line is. This is my land." Brenda's face pinched like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "The HOA board voted on this location 8 months ago. We've already invested over $30,000 in planning and permits. You can't just stop a community improvement project." "Watch me," I said. "Either you stop construction right now, or I'm calling the police and my lawyer." She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to decide if I was bluffing. I wasn't. Fine, she said finally. "We'll pause construction until we can sort this out. But I'm telling you right now, Mr. Quinlan, you're making an enemy of the entire community." "I'm not trying to make enemies," I said. "I'm trying to stop you from stealing my land." She turned on her heel and marched back to her Mercedes, nearly slipping on a patch of ice in the process. The foreman told his crew to pack it up, and within an hour, the construction site was empty except for the concrete forms they had already poured. I went back inside and immediately called my real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Morrison who'd handled my property purchase. When I explained the situation, she sighed heavily. "Of course it's Brenda Carmichael," Patricia said. "I've dealt with her before. She's a piece of work." "Can they just build on my property like this?" I asked. "Absolutely not," Patricia said. but they're going to fight you on it. I'll file an immediate cease and desist and request an emergency injunction. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos, keep records of every interaction." I spent the rest of that weekend photographing the construction site, the property markers, and printing out copies of my survey and deed. I also installed a few trail cameras aimed at the construction area, just in case anyone tried to continue working without my knowledge. On Monday morning, Patricia filed the paperwork. By Monday afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a guy named Douglas Hendricks, claiming that my property survey was incorrect and that the land in question had been designated as HOA Common Area in 1998, before I'd purchased the property. That was complete nonsense, and I knew it. My property had been owned by Mr. Patterson since 1987, long before the HOA even existed. The HOA had been formed in 2001 when a developer built out the surrounding subdivision, but my 5 acres and a few other properties had been specifically excluded because they were already privately owned. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. Patricia filed for the injunction, which was granted. The HOA filed a countersuit claiming I was interfering with community improvements. I filed a trespassing complaint. They filed a complaint with the county claiming I was running a business on residential property because I worked from home. It was exhausting and expensive, and we hadn't even gotten to the actual court date yet. Then, in early February, I discovered something interesting. I was going through old property records at the county clerk's office, trying to build my case, when I found the original HOA formation documents from 2001. There was a map attached showing exactly which properties were included in the HOA and which were excluded. My property was clearly marked as excluded, with a handwritten note that said, "Patterson parcel not included per agreement dated August 15, 2001. I made copies of everything and rushed them to Patricia's office. "This is exactly what we need," she said, examining the documents. "This proves your property was explicitly excluded from the HOA. They have no claim to any part of your land." "So we win?" I asked. "We should," Patricia said, "but knowing Brenda, she'll drag this out as long as possible." She was right. The court date got pushed back twice because the HOA kept filing motions and requesting extensions. Meanwhile, winter was fading into spring, and the half-finished concrete foundation on my property was becoming an eyesore. In late March, I got a surprise visit from Brenda herself. I was working in my home office when I heard an aggressive knocking on my front door. When I opened it, she was standing there with another woman I didn't recognize. "Mr. Quinlan," Brenda said, her voice sickeningly sweet, "this is Donna Pearson, our HOA vice president. We'd like to discuss a compromise." I really didn't want to let them in, but curiosity got the better of me. "Fine. 5 minutes." They followed me into my living room but didn't sit down when I gestured to the couch. "We've reviewed the documents you provided to the court," Brenda said, "and while we still believe our interpretation is correct, we're willing to make a one-time offer. We'll pay you $15,000 for an easement to use that corner of your property for the snow removal depot." I almost laughed. $15,000? You've already admitted you've spent $30,000 on planning, and the actual construction will probably cost another $100,000 or more. And you want to buy an easement on my land for $15,000? Donna spoke up for the first time. "It's a very generous offer, considering the HOA provides services that benefit your property value." "What services?" I said. "I'm not part of your HOA except for road maintenance, which I already pay for. You don't maintain my property, you don't enforce rules on my property, and you certainly don't have the right to build on my property." Brenda's fake smile disappeared. "Mr. Quinlan, you're being unreasonable. This depot will serve the entire community, including you. When it snows, your roads will be cleared." "My roads are already cleared," I said. "That's what I pay my HOA fee for. This depot is so you can store your equipment and salt on my land instead of paying for storage somewhere else." $20,000, Brenda said. "Final offer." "Not interested," I said. "In fact, here's my offer. You can lease the land from me for $5,000 per month with a 10-year minimum contract. That's $60,000 per year, $600,000 over 10 years. Take it or leave it." I'd just thrown out a ridiculous number to make a point, but Brenda's face went red with rage. "You're trying to extort the HOA," she shouted. "I'm not trying to extort anyone," I said calmly. "You're the ones who want to use my property. If you want to use it, you pay for it. Otherwise, tear out that foundation and build your depot somewhere else." "Get out," Donna said to me, which was funny because we were in my house. "You're in my house," I pointed out. They left in a huff, and I immediately called Patricia to tell her about the conversation. "Good," she said. "You held your ground. Their offer was insulting, and your counteroffer makes it clear you're serious about this being your property." The court date finally arrived in mid-April. We went before Judge Martha Reynolds, who had a reputation for being no-nonsense and not tolerating any games. The HOA's attorney, Douglas Hendricks, was a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who probably charged $500 an hour. He presented the HOA's case, arguing that the property line had been incorrectly surveyed and that the depot location had been designated as common area. Patricia calmly presented our evidence, my deed, my survey, the original HOA formation documents, and the handwritten note explicitly excluding my property. She also presented the construction photos showing how the HOA had begun building without even verifying the property lines. Judge Reynolds looked annoyed as she reviewed the documents. When Douglas tried to argue that the handwritten note wasn't legally binding, she cut him off. "Counsel, I've reviewed all the evidence, and it's abundantly clear that Mr. Quinlan's property was excluded from the HOA at its formation. The document you're trying to dismiss is signed by the HOA's founding president and notarized. Unless you have evidence that this document is fraudulent, I'm not interested in hearing arguments about it." Douglas tried a different approach. "Your Honor, the HOA has already invested substantial funds in this project, and the depot will serve the community interest. We request that the court allow the project to continue and order Mr. Quinlan to accept reasonable compensation." "Absolutely not," Judge Reynolds said. "The HOA built on private property without permission. That's called trespassing, and in some cases, it could be considered criminal trespassing. Mr. Quinlan has every right to demand the structure be removed." Brenda, who was sitting in the gallery, actually gasped. The judge continued. "However, I'm going to give the HOA a choice. You can either remove the foundation you've poured at your own expense, or you can negotiate a lease agreement with Mr. Quinlan at fair market rates. If you can't come to an agreement within 30 days, I'll order the removal of the structure and award Mr. Quinlan damages for the trespass." She banged her gavel, and the hearing was over. Outside the courthouse, Patricia was grinning. That went better than I expected. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now they have to negotiate with you in good faith, or they lose everything they've already built," she said. "You're in the driver's seat." I felt pretty good as I drove home that afternoon. Finally, the HOA would have to treat me with respect and pay fair value for using my land. I should have known it wouldn't be that easy. 2 days later, I came home from a grocery run to find that someone had spray-painted HOA hater across my garage door in huge red letters. I immediately called the police and filed a report, but there were no cameras that had caught the vandals, and the responding officer basically said there wasn't much they could do unless I had evidence of who did it. I installed security cameras that day. Front door, back door, garage, and several covering the property line where the foundation was. The vandalism continued. Someone let the air out of all 4 of my tires. Someone threw eggs at my front windows. Someone left a dead raccoon on my porch, which was particularly disgusting. Every incident was reported to the police, and every incident was documented. I sent copies of all the police reports to Patricia, who forwarded them to Douglas Hendricks with a note that this kind of harassment would only make things worse for the HOA. A week after the court hearing, I received a formal letter from Douglas requesting a meeting to discuss lease terms. Patricia and I met with Douglas and Brenda at a conference room in Douglas's office. Brenda looked like she'd been sucking on lemons the entire drive over. Douglas, to his credit, was professional. "Mr. Quinlan," Douglas began, "my clients are interested in negotiating a long-term lease for the parcel of land where the depot foundation has been constructed. What terms would you find acceptable?" Patricia had helped me prepare for this. We'd researched commercial land lease rates in the Boulder area and came up with a proposal. "I want $3,000 per month," I said. "That's $36,000 per year. The lease will be for 20 years, with rent increasing 3% annually to account for inflation. The HOA will be responsible for all maintenance, property taxes on that specific parcel, and any liability related to the depot structure. If the HOA breaches the lease or fails to make payments, I have the right to terminate immediately and demand removal of the structure at the HOA's expense. Brenda's mouth fell open. That's over $700,000 over 20 years. That's outrageous. That's fair market rate for commercial land use in this area, Patricia said smoothly. If you don't want to pay it, remove your foundation and build somewhere else. Douglas held up a hand to quiet Brenda. We'll need to discuss this with the HOA board and put it to a vote. Can you give us 2 weeks? You have until the judge's 30-day deadline, Patricia said. After that, Mr. Quinlan will request an order for removal. We left the meeting, and I felt both excited and nervous. $3,000 a month would be incredible passive income, but I wasn't sure the HOA would actually agree to it. Over the next week, I started hearing from neighbors. Most of them were sympathetic and said they didn't blame me for standing my ground. A few, however, seemed to think I was being greedy. One neighbor, a man named Carl who lived 2 streets over, actually confronted me while I was getting my mail. You know the HOA fees are going to go up because of you, right? He said. We're all going to have to pay more because you want to be a landlord. The HOA fees are going up because Brenda and the board didn't do their due diligence before building on my property, I said. If they'd checked the property lines first, none of this would have happened. Still, Carl said, you could be a good neighbor and work something out. I tried, I said. They offered me $15,000 for permanent use of my land. That's insulting. Would you give up part of your property for that? Carl didn't have an answer for that and walked away muttering. The deadline was approaching, and I hadn't heard anything from the HOA. Patricia called Douglas twice to ask about the status, and both times he said the board was still discussing it. On day 29, with just 1 day left before the deadline, I got a call from Douglas. Mr. Quinlan, the HOA board has voted to accept your lease terms with 2 modifications, he said. They want the lease to be for 15 years instead of 20, and they want the annual increase capped at 2% instead of 3%. I talked it over with Patricia, who said 15 years was still a great deal, and 2% was reasonable. Fine, I said, but I want the first and last month's rent up front, plus a security deposit equal to 3 months' rent. That's $15,000 before they can continue construction. There was a pause. I'll discuss it with the board and call you back. He called back within 2 hours. They've agreed. I'll have the lease documents drawn up by tomorrow. I couldn't believe it was actually happening. Within 3 days, I had a signed lease agreement and a check for $15,000 deposited in my bank account. Patricia reviewed every word of the lease to make sure there were no surprises, and everything was exactly as we'd negotiated. The HOA could now legally build their snow removal depot on my land, and I'd be collecting $3,000 per month for the next 15 years. That was $540,000, plus the increases for inflation, which would bring the total to somewhere around $600,000. For a plot of land that I wasn't even using, it was an incredible windfall. Construction resumed in early May. The crew finished the foundation and built a large metal structure that looked like an oversized garage. It was about 30 feet by 40 feet, with several bays for trucks and equipment. They also paved a driveway connecting it to the main road, which actually improved access to the back part of my property. Brenda never spoke to me again, which was fine by me. Every month, like clockwork, I received a direct deposit of $3,000 from the Silverstone Meadows HOA. I set up a separate savings account just for that money and watched it grow. The story should have ended there, but of course, it didn't. In August, about 4 months after the lease was signed, I noticed something strange. The HOA was using the depot for more than just snow removal equipment. They were storing landscaping equipment, maintenance vehicles, and what looked like personal vehicles belonging to board members. I reviewed the lease agreement carefully. It specifically stated the depot was for snow removal equipment and related seasonal maintenance supplies. Landscaping equipment could arguably fall under that, but personal vehicles definitely didn't. I documented everything with photos and videos from my security cameras, then sent a formal letter to the HOA board through Patricia. Your entertain. Your use of the depot for storage of personal vehicles is a violation of the lease agreement, the letter stated. You have 10 days to remove any items not related to snow removal and seasonal maintenance, or I will consider it a material breach of the lease. Douglas called me directly this time, sounding frustrated. Mr. Quinlan, you're being pedantic. The depot has extra space and it makes sense to use it. The lease is specific for a reason, I said. If you want to store other things there, we can renegotiate the lease with higher rent to reflect the expanded use. There was a long silence. How much higher? Another $1,000 per month, I said. $4,000 total, or you remove everything that's not snow removal related. More silence. Then, I'll get back to you. 3 days later, all the personal vehicles and non-approved equipment were gone. They chose to comply with the original lease rather than pay more, which was fine by me. But the situation had made me realize something important. The HOA board, and Brenda in particular, were always going to try to push boundaries and take advantage wherever they could. I needed to stay vigilant. In October, I received a notice from the county that my property taxes were being reassessed because of the improvements on my land. The depot structure had increased my property's assessed value, which meant higher taxes. I immediately contacted Patricia. The lease specifically states the HOA is responsible for taxes related to the depot parcel. She reviewed the county's assessment and fired off a letter to the HOA. Within 2 weeks, the HOA had agreed to reimburse me for the increased taxes. It amounted to about $800 per year, which they paid as a lump sum. Winter arrived, and the depot served its intended purpose. The HOA's snow removal crews would show up during storms, load up their trucks with salt and equipment from the depot, and clear the neighborhood roads. I had to admit, it was efficient, and the roads were cleared faster than they had been in previous years. But in January 2025, I discovered something that made my blood boil. I was reviewing my property tax documents for the previous year when I noticed something odd. The county records showed that the HOA had applied for a commercial use permit for the depot in my name without my knowledge or consent. This was a problem for several reasons. First, applying for permits using someone else's name without permission was fraud. Second, the commercial use permit would change my property's zoning classification, which could have all sorts of implications for future use and taxes. Third, it was just incredibly brazen and illegal. I called Patricia immediately. When I explained what I'd found, she was silent for a moment. This is serious, she finally said. Filing a false permit application is fraud. You could press criminal charges. I want to, I said. I'm tired of them constantly trying to screw me over. Patricia drafted a letter to the county explaining that the permit application was fraudulent and requesting it be withdrawn. She also sent a letter to the HOA board putting them on notice that we were considering criminal charges. Douglas called within an hour of receiving the letter. Mr. Quinlan, there's been a misunderstanding. The permit application was filed by a contractor who misunderstood the instructions. A misunderstanding, I said. Someone forged my signature on a government document. That's a crime. No one forged anything, Douglas said quickly. The application was filed electronically, and the contractor used the wrong property owner name by mistake. I want to see proof of that, I said. I want the name of the contractor, copies of all communications, and a written explanation of how this mistake happened. And I want the HOA to pay for any legal fees I've incurred dealing with this. That's unreasonable, Douglas started to say. No, what's unreasonable is committing fraud, I interrupted. You have 48 hours to provide everything I've asked for, or I'm going to the police. I wasn't bluffing, and Douglas must have realized it because he agreed. 2 days later, I received a thick envelope with copies of emails between the HOA board and a contractor named Mike's Construction Services. The emails showed that Brenda had specifically instructed the contractor to file the permit application under the property owner's name, without clarifying that the property owner was me, and that I hadn't given permission. When I showed the emails to Patricia, she whistled. This is bad for them. Brenda knew exactly what she was doing. Can we press charges? I asked. We can file a police report and let the district attorney decide whether to prosecute, Patricia said. But I think we should give them one more chance to make this right. If they pay your legal fees and issue a formal apology, we can let it go. If they refuse, we go nuclear. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to see Brenda face consequences for her actions, but another part of me just wanted this nightmare to be over. Send them a demand letter, I said. $10,000 for legal fees and a written apology from Brenda and the board. If they refuse, we file a police report. Patricia sent the letter. 3 days later, I received a check for $10,000 and a letter signed by all 5 board members, including Brenda, apologizing for the administrative error and assuring me it wouldn't happen again. The apology was clearly written by Douglas and was as impersonal as possible, but it was in writing, which was what mattered. Things were quiet for several months after that. The lease payments kept coming, the depot was being used appropriately, and the HOA seemed to have finally accepted that they couldn't push me around. Then, in June 2025, Brenda resigned as HOA president. I heard through neighborhood gossip that there had been a big fight at a board meeting about how much money the HOA was paying me for the depot lease. Several homeowners had demanded an explanation for why the fees had gone up, and when they found out it was because of the depot situation, they'd been furious. Apparently, Brenda had tried to blame everything on me, saying I was an unreasonable neighbor who was extorting the HOA. But several board members had contradicted her and explained that the situation was entirely the HOA's fault for building on my property without permission. The board voted to ask for her resignation, and she'd complied rather than face a recall election. The new HOA president was a reasonable guy named Tom Bradford, who worked as an engineer at one of the tech companies in Boulder. He reached out to me in July with an introduction email. Mr. Quinlan, I wanted to reach out and introduce myself as the new HOA president. I've reviewed the depot lease agreement, and I want you to know that the board is committed to honoring all terms and maintaining a professional relationship. If you ever have any concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. I appreciated the gesture and responded with a polite thank you email. Tom turned out to be as good as his word. Over the next several months, the HOA operated the depot professionally and without any issues. The lease payments continued on time, and there were no more attempts to use the space for unauthorized purposes. In November 2025, Colorado got hit with a massive early-season snowstorm that dumped 3 feet of snow in less than 24 hours. It was one of the worst storms I'd seen since moving to the area. The depot proved its worth during that storm. The HOA crews were able to respond quickly and efficiently, clearing the roads in our neighborhood long before the county crews made it out to our area. My driveway was plowed without me even asking, which I assumed was a gesture of goodwill from Tom. I sent him a thank you email, and he responded saying it was the least they could do since I was hosting their depot. As winter continued, I found myself actually developing a decent relationship with Tom and some of the other board members. They invited me to a neighborhood holiday party in December, and I decided to go. It was held at the community center, a nice building funded by HOA fees that I'd never actually visited before. There were probably 50 people there, eating cookies and drinking hot cider while Christmas music played in the background. Tom introduced me around, and most people were friendly. A few gave me cold looks, probably still bitter about the depot situation and the resulting fee increases, but no one was openly hostile. I was talking to a neighbor named Susan about her landscaping business when Brenda showed up. She'd apparently decided to attend, even though she was no longer on the board. She saw me across the room and her face went tight. For a moment, I thought she might cause a scene, but instead, she just turned and walked to the opposite side of the room. Tom noticed and came over to me. Sorry about that. I didn't think she'd come. It's fine, I said. I'm not here to cause problems. I know you're not, Tom said. And for what it's worth, I think the board handled the whole depot situation terribly from the start. If they'd just talked to you and negotiated fairly in the first place, everyone would have been better off. I appreciated his honesty. Thanks for saying that. The party was actually enjoyable, and I left feeling more connected to my neighborhood than I had in the 2 years I'd lived there. As 2025 turned into 2026, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. My software engineering work was going well, the lease payments from the HOA were padding my savings account nicely, and I'd even started dating someone I'd met through a hiking group. In March 2026, I received an interesting phone call from Douglas Hendricks. Mr. Quinlan, I'm calling on behalf of the HOA board. They've asked me to inquire whether you'd be interested in selling the parcel of land where the depot is located, rather than continuing the lease arrangement. I was surprised. Why would they want to buy it now? The board has concerns about the long-term cost of the lease, Douglas said. They've calculated that over 15 years, they'll pay you over $600,000. They believe it might be more cost-effective to purchase the land outright. How much are they offering? I asked. $250,000, Douglas said. I actually laughed. They're going to pay me $600,000 over 15 years, and they want to buy out of the lease for $250,000? That doesn't make sense for me at all. What would make sense? Douglas asked. I thought about it. The steady monthly income was nice, but a lump sum could be invested and potentially grow even more. On the other hand, I'd already received almost $70,000 from the lease, so I'd only have about $530,000 left to receive over the remaining 12 years. $450,000, I said. That's less than they'd pay over the life of the lease, so they save money, and I get a lump sum I can invest. I'll present it to the board, Douglas said. 2 weeks later, he called back. The board has agreed to $350,000, which is their final offer. I talked it over with Patricia and my financial advisor. After some consideration, I decided to accept. $350,000 plus the $70,000 I'd already received would give me a total of $420,000 from a piece of land I'd never planned to use anyway. The sale closed in May 2026. The HOA now owned the parcel where the depot sat, and I had a very healthy bank account. With the extra money, I decided to finally propose to my girlfriend, Zara Hensley. I'd been planning to wait another year, but the financial security from the land sale made me feel ready. She said yes, and we started planning a wedding for the fall. Life was good. The nightmare with the HOA had turned into the best thing that could have happened to me financially. I'd gone from being angry about trespassing to being grateful that Brenda and the board had been so incompetent. In August, I ran into Tom Bradford at a coffee shop in Boulder. We chatted for a few minutes, and he mentioned that the HOA had just finished paying off the loan they'd taken out to buy my land. It was tight for a while, Tom admitted, but the homeowners voted to approve a special assessment to cover it. Most people understood it was better to own the land than keep paying a lease. Did everyone vote for it? I asked. Tom grinned. Brenda voted against it. She's still bitter about the whole thing. I couldn't help but laugh. Some people never change. True, Tom said. But hey, you got a fair deal. We got the land we needed, and everyone can move on. That's about as good an outcome as we could have hoped for. He was right. The situation had worked out well for everyone, except maybe Brenda's pride. As I drove home that day, I thought about everything that had happened since that snowy January morning when I discovered construction equipment on my property. It had been stressful and exhausting at times, but standing my ground had paid off in ways I never could have imagined. I'd learned that HOAs could be nightmares when run by power-hungry people like Brenda, but they could also be reasonable when led by competent people like Tom. I'd learned that knowing your property rights and being willing to fight for them was essential. And I'd learned that sometimes the worst situations can turn into unexpected blessings. The money from the land sale became the down payment on the house Zara and I bought together after our wedding in October. It was a beautiful property in Longmont, about 15 miles from Boulder, with no HOA. We'd learned that lesson well. On our first night in the new house, Zara and I were unpacking boxes in the kitchen when she asked me if I ever regretted how things had gone with the HOA. Not even a little bit, I said. They tried to steal my land, and I turned it into $420,000. That's not a bad outcome. Do you think Brenda ever figured out she could have avoided all of this by just asking you first? Zara asked. I thought about it. Probably not. People like her don't think they need to ask permission for anything. That's why they end up in situations like this. Zara unpacked a set of wine glasses and set them on the counter. Well, I'm glad she was terrible at her job. Otherwise, we might not have this house. She had a point. If Brenda had been competent and had verified property lines before starting construction, or if she'd approached me respectfully from the beginning, we probably could have worked out a reasonable arrangement. Maybe I would have leased them the land for $1,000 a month, or maybe I would have sold it to them for $50,000. But because she'd been arrogant and dismissive, because she'd assumed she could just take what she wanted, she'd ended up costing the HOA hundreds of thousands of dollars and getting herself forced to resign. Sometimes karma worked in mysterious ways. A few months after we moved into our new house, I got an unexpected piece of mail. It was a Christmas card from Tom Bradford. Inside, he'd written a short note. Ryan wanted to wish you and Zara a Merry Christmas and thank you again for being reasonable during the depot sale. The neighborhood is doing well, and we haven't had any major HOA drama since you left. Hope you're enjoying your new place. Best wishes, Tom. It was a nice gesture, and it reminded me that not everyone associated with that HOA had been terrible. Tom had done his best to clean up the mess Brenda had created, and he'd succeeded. I sent him back a card thanking him and wishing the neighborhood well. In January 2027, almost exactly 3 years after the whole ordeal had started, I got a phone call from Patricia Morrison. "Ryan, I have interesting news," she said. "Brenda Carmichael is being sued by another property owner in a different HOA. Apparently she's now on the board of her new community and she's pulled the same stunt. She approved construction on what she thought was common area, but it turned out to be someone's private property." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're kidding?" "Nope," Patricia said. "The property owner's attorney reached out to me asking if I'd be willing to consult on the case and share our documentation. I wanted to check with you first." "Absolutely," I said. "If my experience can help someone else, I'm happy to share." Patricia ended up consulting on the case, and from what I heard, it followed a similar pattern to mine. Brenda and her new HOA board had to negotiate a lease with the property owner, and Brenda eventually resigned from that board too. Some people really never learned. As for me, life moved on. Zara and I settled into our new house, and I continued my software engineering work. The money from the depot sale was invested wisely and continued to grow. We talked about starting a family and maybe buying a vacation property in a few years. Every now and then, when I drove past my old property in Silverstone Meadows, I'd see the depot sitting on what used to be my land. It always made me smile. That ugly metal building represented one of the most stressful periods of my life, but it also represented standing up for myself and being rewarded for it. The lesson I took away from the whole experience was simple. Know your rights, document everything, and never let anyone bully you into giving up what's yours. Whether it's an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone else, you have the right to defend your property and demand fair treatment. And if they refuse to be fair, make them pay for it. Literally. Years later, whenever someone asked me about my experience with HOAs, I'd tell them the whole story. Most people were amazed that it had worked out so well for me. A few asked if I felt bad about taking so much money from the HOA. My answer was always the same. I didn't take anything from the HOA. They trespassed on my property, and I gave them the option to either remove their structure or pay fair market rate to use my land. They chose to pay, and later they chose to buy. Every step of the way, they had choices, and they made the decisions that were best for them. The fact that those decisions ended up being very profitable for me wasn't something I needed to feel guilty about. Zara always backed me up on this. "They could have just asked you first," she'd point out. "They could have offered you a fair price from the beginning. They chose to be aggressive and dismissive, and it cost them." She was right, as usual. In the spring of 2027, I got one final piece of closure on the whole situation. I received a letter from the Silverstone Meadows HOA board, signed by Tom and the other board members, officially acknowledging that the depot parcel sale had been completed and all terms had been satisfied. It was a formal legal conclusion to a chapter of my life that had lasted 3 years. I filed the letter away with all the other documentation from the case. I had boxes full of papers, surveys, deeds, lease agreements, court filings, police reports, photographs, and correspondence. It was a comprehensive record of everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to throw it all away and forget about it, but another part of me knew those documents might be valuable someday. Maybe to help someone else in a similar situation, or maybe just as a reminder of what I'd been through and overcome. I kept the boxes in storage, just in case. By the summer of 2027, the whole HOA depot saga felt like a distant memory. Zara and I were focused on our lives together, our careers, and our future. The money we'd made from the sale was being put to good use, and we had no regrets about how things had turned out. One evening in July, we were having dinner on our back patio when Zara brought up something that surprised me. "You know what I think is funny?" she said. "You always talk about how much you hate HOAs, but you're considering joining the board of our neighborhood association." She was right. Our new neighborhood in Longmont had a voluntary neighborhood association, not a mandatory HOA. They organized social events and maintained some common areas, but they had no enforcement power and no mandatory fees. I'd been thinking about joining the board because I wanted to help make the neighborhood better. "That's different," I said. "A voluntary association where people work together because they want to is completely different from an HOA where a power-hungry board can fine you for having the wrong color mailbox." Zara smiled. "I know, I'm just teasing you. I think you'd be great on the board. You have experience dealing with difficult people and complex property issues." She had a point. My experience with Brenda and the Silverstone Meadows HOA had taught me a lot about how not to run a community organization. If I joined our neighborhood association board, I could use those lessons to make sure we did things right. I ended up joining the board in September, and it turned out to be a great decision. I was able to help organize neighborhood events, coordinate with the city on some improvements to our local park, and generally make our community a better place to live. And I made sure that any time there was a question about property lines or community projects, we verified everything carefully and communicated with property owners before taking any action. The lessons from my HOA nightmare were put to good use. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that while the HOA depot situation had been incredibly stressful at the time, it had ultimately made me a stronger, more confident person. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to understand property law, to work effectively with attorneys, and to negotiate from a position of strength. Those skills had value far beyond the $420,000 I'd received. They'd given me confidence in other areas of my life, helped me in my career, and made me a better partner to Zara. Sometimes, the worst experiences teach us the most valuable lessons. As I write this in late 2027, almost 4 years after the whole thing started, I can say with certainty that I have no lingering anger or resentment about what happened. Brenda and the HOA board tried to take advantage of me, but they failed. Justice was served, I was fairly compensated, and life moved on. If anything, I'm grateful for the experience. It taught me things I never would have learned otherwise, and it resulted in financial benefits that changed my life for the better. And somewhere in Boulder, there's still a metal depot sitting on land that used to be mine, storing snow removal equipment for a neighborhood I no longer live in. Every winter, crews load up their trucks from that depot and clear the roads, never knowing the full story of how that building came to be there. But I know, and that's enough. The final irony is that the whole situation could have been avoided if Brenda and the HOA board had simply done their due diligence, checked the property lines, and approached me respectfully from the beginning. If they'd offered me a fair deal up front, I probably would have accepted it without any drama. Instead, their arrogance and incompetence turned a simple real estate transaction into a multi-year legal battle that cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars and ended with a board president resigning in disgrace. The moral of the story? Always verify your property lines before building anything. Always treat property owners with respect. And never, ever underestimate someone just because they seem like they won't fight back. I'm Ryan Quinlan, and this is the story of how an HOA built their snow removal depot on my land and ended up paying me forever for their mistake. Well, not quite forever, but $420,000 is a pretty good consolation prize for 3 years of headaches. And now, whenever someone complains about their HOA, I just smile and tell them it could always be worse, or better, depending on your perspective.